Good evening. It is 6:29 p.m. on September 15, 2022. I want to talk quickly about sexually transmitted diseases. Now, apparently, at some point in time, there was a designation of sexually transmitted disorders, but the parlance, at least for the last 15 to 20 years, has been sexually transmitted diseases. I am going to not discuss what were previously considered sexual disorders, including hermaphrodism, homosexuality, or things of that ilk, things that would have to do more with behaviors that some would consider disorders, including that have historically been allowed to be identified as medical disorders and psychological disorders, including that at some point somebody determined was applicable for treatment, which now is considered questionable. I'm going to talk specifically about what is identified as sexually transmitted diseases, including the kinds of sexually transmitted diseases that are reported on by the Centers for Disease Control, including on an annual basis. As a matter of fact, one of the topics I've been trying to have addressed, including in an official capacity, were reports by the Centers for Disease Control that were released in October 2017 regarding updates to the status of reporting on sexually transmitted diseases, specifically sexually transmitted diseases impacting women. This was notable because it happened following Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, when several places were in a state of emergency, but also in a context wherein a number of other changes were happening. This was concerning to me because I had encounters with and concerns regarding activities that occurred during Super Bowl 51 in Houston, Texas, that I understand now and learned shortly thereafter were not unprecedented and were actually potentially connected to concerns that had arisen earlier at a Super Bowl that also happened in Texas, happened in Dallas several years earlier. First, let's talk about HIV and AIDS. Now, my understanding is that for a long time, HIV and AIDS has been considered to be a fatal disease. The genesis to AIDS from having HIV is something that has been a topic of concern for a considerable amount of time. Please remember that at the onset, before it was called HIV/AIDS, it was called GRID, Gay-Related Immunodeficiency Disease. This is very important for understanding the historical genesis of the typecasting and the manners in which treatment, medical treatment, but also legal treatment has developed when it comes to the relationships people have in the state of need, including the state of medical need or potentially even a state of incapacitation. It's understood for a considerable amount of time that there were various kinds of symptomatologies that would develop and that if it was not early identified, it could lead to other kinds of diseases, including one that came to be known for a time as a very frequently occurring one where it should not be caught in time, called Kaposi's sarcoma. It was abbreviated KS. This is of concern to me because Kaposi's sarcoma involves the appearance of lesions on the skin. I still, at this time, do not believe there has been enough research and enough forthcomingness about the relationship between Kaposi's sarcoma and other kinds of skin disorders, dermatological disorders, or even cancers of the skin, like malignant melanoma. I disclosed that my grandmother died of malignant melanoma right after I was born. So this is something that I have a personal concern with. But besides that, the understanding that HIV was identified as a disease that was sexually transmitted when body fluids came into contact with each other. It's a blood-borne disease. Presumably, at least, it cannot be transmitted through semen, either through oral sex or some other kind of contact between semen and a body cavity, including insofar as there needs to be more further explication of contact of semen with blood. But the understanding of it being that the semen with the blood barrier can actually be a transmittal. The early days at the onset of HIV/AIDS and the awareness around it was understood that it was primarily a disease that was contracted by men who had sex with other men. One of the things that happened, however, during the 1990s is that there was a greater appearance of HIV/AIDS that was impacting women, specifically women of color. Now, I don't know if you remember this, but during that time frame, there were also a number of legal matters that were coming into fruition about legal treatment and legal responses, including things like and relationships people had when it came to medical treatment. The difference, for instance, between a blood family member making a decision if you were incapacitated and diagnosed with HIV/AIDS and somebody that might have been considered an intimate partner, and the legal means by which one could actually get recognition for end-of-life matters or terminal illness matters to be decided upon in the event that somebody was incapacitated by somebody they considered to be an intimate partner or they considered to be a close friend. So this is very important because in the mid-1990s toward the early 2000s, one of the things that was being identified by people that were involved with treating and attempting to prevent STDs was the noticeable increase that was occurring with women as opposed to just primarily with men, including insofar as it was impacting women of color. This was something that there was awareness to, and the social and political implications were also being brought to bear, including the relationship between STDs and poverty. STDs and poverty and the myriad issues that have to do with poverty, including racism and its relationship to institutionalization, primarily incarceration, but not exclusively incarceration. Now, understanding is over the last several years, this phenomenon specific to the United States has not been exclusive. There have been other kinds of matters related to HIV, and AIDS transmission in other countries that have some similar instances and also have some distinct context. But I'm speaking specifically regarding HIV/AIDS transmission in the United States and the awarenesses that have been able to be developed over the last several years in this regard. Of course, the first primary matter to consider is prevention in the form of either abstinence or a period of celibacy, at least until such time as one and their intimate sex partner that they should determine that they wish to have sex with can go through a process of getting tested, including potentially together, in order to assure that they are not at risk. And even if it should be determined that one is either at risk or has already been exposed, there are things that can be done and can be engaged in order to prevent transmission from somebody who is HIV positive to somebody who is not. Those are personal decisions, but I really advise people to take them under consideration. In a period of waiting, for instance, once you decide to sex bond, and what else could be considered in terms of intimacy, especially if you're willing, and hopefully you are, to have the courage to actually be forthright with your partner. You know, some of us have not had that experience, right? Some of us have been more impetuous. And perhaps now would be a time for us all to consider that kind of fortitude that goes into a relationship when one agrees to make that kind of decision with their partner. Otherwise, there are prophylactics that are recommended, but please remember, even using a condom does not eliminate the risk of HIV and AIDS transmission. This is something that has to be emphasized because even if you do get ready access to condoms, you have to be aware it is not 100% capable of refusing the transmission insofar as it may be there. I also want to talk about other diseases shortly, about diseases such as what is known as gonorrhea and what is known as chlamydia, and also what is known as genital herpes. These are all diseases that have been known of for a considerable amount of time. The history of these diseases and their relationship to the United States, including the United States insofar as there were people from the United States that would travel and either expose other people to it after they've acquired it or bring it to the United States after traveling, cannot be underemphasized. As a matter of fact, it has recently come to my attention that even during World War I, as well as during World War II, that part of the campaign, not only for recruitment, but for actually preparing people for deployment abroad, was to bring awareness to the context of sexually transmitted diseases, or what they called at the time venereal diseases, including the ones just mentioned. Personally and politically, I think it's very important to understand that kind of relationship, especially if you have somebody in your family or somebody that you might be thinking about being intimate with who has had military experience. As a matter of discipline, I personally believe there should be very strict enforcement of people's recreational sexual activities while they're stationed abroad. There are actually legal consequences for people abusing their position when they are stationed abroad and engaging in sexual activities, including with people that are in the military, but also with people that are not in the military and that are located in the countries where they've been deployed. But even upon coming home or even upon just being in general society, and for people who have no military experience. These are also diseases that people can be exposed to. Again, in some manners, the use of a condom does help, but again, it's not 100% capable of preventing transmission insofar as it should exist. Understanding, of course, is that with genital herpes, it is a kind of disease that can be transmitted even if there is not a symptomatology at the time. Herpes is not constant. Herpes is something that can potentially have an appearance or what they call a breakout, and then it recedes. But even if you do not have an appearance of a symptom, you can still contract it and you can still spread it. Now, there's a difference between genital herpes and oral herpes. And perhaps you might have seen, or you might personally have been somebody that gets a cold sore on your lip. I'm in the process personally of investigating, not only in relationship to herpes, including oral herpes and or genital herpes, but maybe other sexually transmitted diseases, the relationship between radio frequency modulation and its impact on us biophysiologically, so as to be able to produce symptomatology, including the symptomatology of something like a herpes or something like a canker sore. This is not unprecedented. There's actually records that I have found that speak to the use of radio frequency and its capacity to impact us biophysiologically, i.e., you may have a dormant virus, or you may not necessarily have that virus, but the impact of the radio frequency activates something that gives the symptomatology that could that way be identified as such by somebody that is a medical practitioner. I believe there needs to be more forthrightness about this. This isn't a proprietary trade secret. It isn't a part of some sort of secret or patented prescription medication program or something that they want to preclude some sort of information distribution on, so that we have misinformation about what we would need pharmacologically in order to deal with this symptomatology should it appear. I believe it's actually a very important matter so that we don't have misinformation. At the same time, it's also very important to know that if you have the intention to engage in sexual activity, and for whatever reason you do not choose celibacy or you do not choose what I've already spoken about, and these are the kinds of diseases a condom is not 100% capable of preventing. Finally, I just want to say that whatever you decide to do, I hope that you do it consensually. And one of the things we don't really talk about is the relationship between what some would call self-pleasure or self-stimulation, i.e. masturbation, or as it's also known, including legally, onanation, and its relationship to our hormone production and how it impacts us hormonally. You know, I went through a period in my life where I used to say it glibly, but actually, seriously, I used to say masturbation was my form of self-care. My understanding is when I'm alone in my room, it's nobody's business what I do. And, you know, if I decide to pleasure myself, it makes me feel good. It balances my moods. You know, it helps me to deal with things physically that I couldn't deal with otherwise. I went through a period of celibacy for several years. I'm over 6 years now, without actually being sexually active. So I have a different relationship with these understandings. I also have a different relationship with the concept of self-pleasure, because for me, celibacy also includes refusing to engage self-pleasure or masturbation. I have my own political reasons for this. I've discussed this elsewhere. But it's also important to consider masturbation in a context of sexual health, including sexual mental health, including the state of mind one is in, and what we allow ourselves to entertain in our fantasy realms. You know, some people believe in the power of manifestation, that if you think about something, if you dream about something, if you fantasize about something, it might actually appear. Some people believe you can actually do that. I don't necessarily disbelieve that's possible. As a matter of fact, I've seen things that I've thought about actually manifest in my life or the lives of other people that I can see through the public realm. And this is something that I've been pursuing in a number of ways, trying to answer questions, because I'm a very inquisitive person in that regard. But if you do decide, for whatever reason, that you need to modify your sexual activity in order to balance out your mental health, please be mindful. Please be mindful that what you allow yourself to entertain psychologically, especially when it comes to sex, is going to have an impact on how you behave when you're exposed to a sexual situation. Somebody hitting on you, somebody flirting with you, somebody saying something that you consider to be sexually offensive, and yet expecting, for whatever reason in the paradigm you're in, that you're supposed to feel delighted, or you're supposed to somehow feel honored, or you're supposed to somehow feel acknowledged. You know, this goes both ways. This goes both ways, what we put out there as opposed to, but also concurrent to, what we allow to take ourselves to take in. So I'm just letting you know that this is not something that I have written off personally, even if I have very strong political opinions about certain policies about which to pursue it. But I also think it's very important that we're in a very important transitional time. I believe there's a lot about what's going on with COVID-19 has not been revealed. And at some point, we're going to have to be forthright about the relationship between sexually transmitted diseases and their connection with various contexts around which biological weapons have been identified and have been attempted for address, not just within the United States, by the way, but within other countries. The concern is that if we are not prudent and we're not able to be honest and tempered, then these revelations are going to be trying to shame us, and the consequences of that shaming can be significant. You know, I will say, as somebody that made a political decision to be celibate, and has been celibate for 6 years, while I'm at what would biologically be identified within the medical community as a sexual prime of my life. This is a very important thing. You know, they talk about a woman's biological clock, but when you're not with a partner and you're also not sexually active, you have to put your mindset to actually being able to maintain balance in your life without actually having that kind of intimacy with a human being. It gives you a different perspective, maybe not a same perspective many other people have had. But in the consequence of that, what I've learned too is that as we get older, we no longer have the fertility we used to have. And so the relationship between sex and procreation is also very important. Some people believe it to be a sacred thing. Some people believe it to be essential to the consideration of our bodies and our rights to make decisions about our bodies. This, to me, calls into question the concept, a constitutional question that needs to be answered. Are our bodies and what our bodies produce and what our bodies contain property? And is it our property? Is my body my property? And does anybody else have the right to say they own it? You see, I consider that to be a 13th Amendment issue. And if the state should intercede to think that it's entitled to try to compel me and my body or any of the materials of my body to be made available through the state to be distributed to anybody else, including a private person, then it calls into question a 14th Amendment argument. So sexually transmitted diseases are not just a medical concern. They're actually a constitutional issue. And so I hope you understand that, and I hope you value yourself enough to take it that seriously. And I hope that whoever you decide you might be interested in as a sex partner would also take you that seriously and understand they have a right to be taken that seriously too. Have a good evening.